Thank you very much, Mr. Big Voice. Good to be here on a Thursday as we're pretty close to wrapping up the work week for a great many people and have a lot going on today. We'll talk a little law enforcement later in this hour, I believe. Don't quote me on this, but I believe Keith Thompson or someone in Keith's capacity will be dropping by a wee bit later. He's with Idaho State Police talking with us about some safety issues and law enforcement in our region, as well as a candidate. Well, the first candidate who's going to be joining me to talk about specifically campaigning for Twin Falls City Council is on the way at 8:40. Her name is Bethany Rathmussen. I think Bethany has been in studio before on another matter. She's 24 years old, got a good head on her shoulders, and believes that this is the place to start, is right here in Twin Falls. So that's coming up a little later in the hour. But first, top story today. I have a couple of things I set aside after some votes in the House and Senate because, well, I'm not trying to surprise anybody, but the government is going to continue. We averted a government shutdown with a temporary bill that will get us until December 11th. President Obama is expected to sign it, and we'll move on and then have some arguments just before Christmas, and then you'll have the House and Senate saying, oh, we've got to get home for the holidays. And they'll rush through another one of these things, and it's all part of the ledger domain to keep the public, the wool over your eyes, if you will. It's 8:08, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 58. Now, we have, if you stop and do the math, we have 2 U.S. senators, and because population-wise, we're not a terribly large state, for those of you out there who wonder how that works, I think there are about 55 members of the U.S. House of Representatives from California, because it's based on population numbers. If you're a member of the House of Representatives, you have a district with about roughly 700,000 people. Well, there's only a little under 1.4 million people living in Idaho right now. So unlike California, we have just 2 members of the House. So they're very much, in a sense, statewide equal to our U.S. senators. The 2 houses do have different sets of rules and the like. Of those 4, 3 voted against this continuing resolution to keep the government open. You might be able to guess who number 4 was, who went along with it. And he has a territory that stretches all through Twin Falls. We'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes because I do have some of the numbers on who voted. There was a vote in the House yesterday. The Senate had already voted. The vote is a sign of the brewing anger in the Republican Party, the writer at Washington Examiner says, over having to fund a private organization like Planned Parenthood that provides abortions. Republicans opposed the bill 91 to 151. 151 Republicans said no. So John Boehner lined up the Democrats, most of whom voted with him, in order to bypass this whole notion that we should actually defund Planned Parenthood because they're butchering little babies over there. And he claims to be, I heard him speak at the March for Life 3 years ago. He claims to be very pro-life. Yeah, right. Speaking of having the wool pulled over our eyes, the writer says all but 3 Democrats voted against it. It was sponsored by Martha Roby. She is a congresswoman. She is from Alabama, which is a very pro-life state. In fact, there's a list here of the senators who actually, for instance, the 2 U.S. senators from Alabama, they actually jumped up and said, no, we will not support keeping the government open at this point because of this issue. But since we're not in Alabama, I'm going to share this with you from the Daily Signal. Find out how your lawmakers voted on government spending bills that avert shutdown and funds Planned Parenthood. So here you go. And if you're wondering how the Idaho folks voted, well, Mike Crapo voted nay. He didn't plan to keep the government open. So if you're a pro-lifer, you've got to be happy at least that he at least made the effort. Also, Jim Risch, he was a no vote. It's been my understanding as I've been doing this show over the last 9 months, we're now in our 10th month, it's been my understanding a lot of people who call themselves conservatives have problems with our Republican delegation. But I said last week, after we had Governor Otter on the air and he agreed with me on a particular topic, I said, once in a while, you got to get behind these people. When they do the things you want them to do, instead of slugging them like you always do, why don't you say, hey, thank you? And you might get a little bit more out of them that way if you take that approach. So our 2 U.S. senators both said no to keeping the government open. They were in a very small group. There were like 18 of them out of 100 who actually said no. And this is a Republican-controlled U.S. Senate, which means most of the Republicans joined Mitch McConnell and they went along to get along. but not Jim Risch and not Mike Crapo. And here are some other names that might be of interest. Mike Lee of Utah, he also voted no. Ted Cruz, of course, voted no. He was the man really behind the no-vote effort. You also have a couple of other people you may recognize here. Rand Paul of Kentucky, he's a presidential candidate, as is Mr. Cruz. He was a no vote. Marco Rubio didn't vote. Now, that could mean he was absent. He might be out campaigning. He's also running for president, as is Lindsey Graham, who did not vote. Although I have a sneaky suspicion that the two of them avoided the vote because this way they can say, well, I didn't vote for it. No, I didn't vote against it. In other words, cross your arms, point your index fingers in opposite directions and say, there you go. Do it that way. 812, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Now, over in the House, how did our congressional delegation vote? Well, Raul Labrador, no surprise, put his foot down. He was with the 151 members of the House of Representatives who said no. And they spurned John Boehner and his fellow travelers in the Democrat Party. Mr. Labrador, unfortunately, does not represent Twin Falls and southeastern Idaho. We are represented by a fellow named Mike Simpson. So you've got Risch, you've got Crapo, and you've got Labrador all saying no. In an effort to defund Planned Parenthood. And you've got Mike Simpson saying, I'll give you 3 guesses and the first 2 don't count. Does that help out? He voted, of course, with John Boehner and the Democrats. Is anyone out there surprised by that? I've been getting enough feedback on this guy over the last several months. Just the other day, I had lunch with Zeb Bell, who's one of my talk radio counterparts, and Zeb said, you know what, I pretty much had to throw him off my show because he said, this guy thinks that he owns the time when he's on the air, and he doesn't like anyone asking him tough questions. Well, that's what people need to do. And I understand that he's never really had any serious opposition. Number one, the Democrats can't mount any, and you wouldn't want them to. But the second part of this is you really have Republicans who've decided they're going to challenge him, and they haven't been very good candidates. You cannot go out and run a campaign on a shoestring budget, generally. Generally, that's the way to put it. You've got to be able to have some resources. Either you self-fund or you've got to have people willing to make up the difference. And apparently people aren't fed up enough who have the money to contribute to campaigns to really give enough money to a primary opponent. And from what I understand, some of the primary opponents were, well, they weren't necessarily talking about, their experiences when they were abducted by aliens, but some of them perhaps weren't as stable as they could have been as challengers. And that means if you want to get rid of this guy, and at this point, there may be no one who can actually do it. But if you want to get rid of him, you've got to really find a serious Republican who has a big sack of cash. And it apparently isn't going to happen anytime soon. So we've just got to be on the lookout for that. Now, if you had a Democrat who came along and was actually a conservative, despite the silly party registration, who knows? Maybe someone like that could gain some traction, but I don't see it happening. And I don't see really a rise of a candidate in Idaho who could be a really good third-party challenger. There is, though, something going on in Congress right now, and it really is akin to the first shots in a revolution. And a lot of it is, I think, because the United States is no longer the powerhouse when we were known as the world's only superpower just a few years ago. We no longer act that way, and because of our budget problems, we probably can't be. And if you look at Europe, when Europe's empires started collapsing, the European political system, and in many of those European countries, they have 5 or 6 viable political parties. Italy used to have a new government every couple of years when I was a kid. I remember I'd pick up the newspaper and read about that, and one guy would come in from one party, and he'd put together a coalition, and that would last a couple of years. Then he'd be gone, or they often were found in the trunks of automobiles. And not alive, I should point out. And then a new guy would come in, and he would take over for a couple of years, and they went through about 50 governments since World War II. It was just incredible. A little bit more stability going on at the moment. The thing is, we may be in the very beginning stages of that happening in this country. And I say that because if you look at what's going on around the world, we don't have the wherewithal to get involved in the Syrian situation or again in Afghanistan. We have a debt that's so high that it's going to eventually squeeze out all of our military spending because people aren't going to give up their Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And for that reason, this is where we're going. And that's why I think we're going to start seeing splinter parties, and you're already seeing the makings of that among the Republicans, very much, and maybe even among the Democrats with the rise of Bernie Sanders. 817, you're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story. Welcome to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
Yes, Bill, I wrote Mr. Simpson a letter, and I kind of knew what the reply was going to be, but I did it anyway. I started out by saying I was glad that John Boehner was gone, and that we need to stop this parent planhood. So I get the letter back, reply.
Dear constituent.
Yes. You okay? All right. And all he talks about is how much good John Boehner did. He didn't say anything about abortion or parent planhood, so I was not surprised.
Pull out the form letter, stick it in an envelope.
Yes.
And send it out.
Bye.
Hey, thank you. I've experienced a few of those myself, and some of them I've saved over the years. And because you're wondering, you just said this in your letter or in your email, and the response is, it's like, who are you replying to? Because that's not what I was talking about. Or they insult your intelligence. The point of the matter is, you're trying to make a valid point with these people. I've seen so many of these letters over the years, and they're all pretty much the same. And it's just they crank them out. There's got to be a guy working in the basement of the Capitol building with an old-fashioned printing press, and they tell him, we need a couple hundred today. All right, master. And then he just starts pulling down the lever, and clunk, 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 clunk. They spit them out. Another guy runs them back upstairs. They stuff them into the envelopes, and they send them out. Seems to me that's a fairly standard system that we have in Washington. And probably, I hate to say this, to a lesser extent, even in Boise. It's 819. The difference is you don't get to see a lot of your senator. Well, Mike Crapo actually has made the effort this summer and as well as in the spring and early part of the year to get out and see people around the state. That's part of his re-election strategy for next year. And I think likely it will serve him very well. But really, you don't see a lot of these people. It's just simply their schedules, and they're 2,100 miles away across the continent for a good part of the year, and they don't have that much time. At least on your state legislative level, you go down to the hardware store on a Saturday, you may run into these people. And on the city and county level, you have even a better chance, I suppose. 20 minutes after 8 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We've got a lot more coming up today. I got to tell you, Donald Trump has said, maybe in the next hour we'll get to this, that if he's elected president, all of those Syrian refugees are going home. Interesting. Wanted to remind you, and this is going to be critical because I want you all to have perfect hearing when you're tuning into this program. So it's time to get your ears, your hearing screened. We'll pin back your ears. Somebody else can do the screening. That would be Dr. Christine Pickup, Doctor of Audiology at Mount Harrison Audiology in Rupert, 1218 9th Street, Unit Number 2. They have a great website, mountharrisonaudiology.com, and you can call directly to the office if you need to make an appointment, 208-312-0957. Are you on medication for high blood pressure or a diuretic? I've had the high blood pressure medicine for a few years, even though wasn't too terribly high. The doctor thought it might be a good idea just because of my age. And frankly, all of us are going to deal with that at some point. These medications can affect your hearing. Hearing health is a reflection of your overall health. When you come in for a free wellness hearing, and that would be a screening, at Mount Harrison Audiology, Dr. Pickup will review your medications and also discuss ways to protect your hearing in the future. You talk a little bit about the decline of American empire. A lot of it is on display right now with what's going on in Syria. It was 3 or 4 years ago, Vladimir Putin tried to broker a deal, and he approached the United States and Britain and said, look, I've got an idea. We'll figure out a way to get Assad to resign, and I'll give him a villa out on the beach on the Crimean Sea or something like that, or the Black Sea. We'll do that, and if you just go along with me, I'll help you get rid of him because I can talk to the man. And President Obama and British Prime Minister David Cameron said no. I think it was Cameron was PM at the time. He's been there now a few years. They said no, and the Syrian situation got out of hand. And then, of course, eventually what we ended up with a situation where, well, you've got a terrible civil war going on there right now. And that civil war just is spinning out of control with this group ISIS and some of the other people involved. There was a discussion about this last night on Bill O'Reilly's program, the O'Reilly Factor on Fox News Channel. He was joined by columnist Charles Krauthammer. And they're essentially saying that President Obama has been snookered on this whole deal and really allowed it to happen.
Do you think this is sort of a rebellion in the Pentagon against the president's awful policies that are now, after Iraq goes down a drain, now Afghanistan might go down a drain? Is there a rebellion going on?
I think it's a recurrence of what's been going on with the entire 2 terms of the Obama years.
But with the generals themselves, though, are they finally reaching critical mass and saying, you got to do something, you can't continue this way?
Well, look, at the very beginning, the generals wanted a far higher number of troops. At the beginning of the Obama years in Afghanistan, he gave them about half, and now we see the result. The generals wanted to keep a residual force in Iraq. Obama said no, he pulled them out, and we see what happened. The generals have asked for a lot of things. They actually recommended, CIA as well, that we help the non-jihadist rebels in Syria to avoid what we're seeing now. Obama said no.
So he's essentially walked away from that entire part of the world. It's almost like a libertarian and not so much even like a liberal Democrat. He's just decided that we're not going to do it any longer. Why? Because his constituency is interested in the Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and not so much in guns. And that means when you do that and you step back from the world stage, someone else is going to end up filling the void, and you may not like what they do, but they're going to take care of things. Military brass, not happy about it. Really, they haven't been happy with the man since he first took office. But as Krauthammer says, he has to follow, or they have to follow, the Constitution.
However much they disagree, they salute and they obey.
Why? They can resign. They can resign and say, yes, this is insane. I think that might be happening.
I think that would be very healthy, because that almost never happens.
Right.
We have, I mean, the last resignation, I think, on principle, was Cyrus Vance in 1980, when he resigned over the Iran rescue mission. We simply don't have a tradition of that, and we should.
And at that point, Bill O'Reilly, he pretty much lost it.
You're right, I think, when it's all about the president's legacy. But now his legacy is tied in with millions of people invading Europe because of his failed policy in Iraq that led to ISIS, that led to the Syrian catastrophe, and now they're all getting the hell out, and they're going to Europe. That's on President Obama, not entirely, but a lot of it. All right? You're going to see the same thing in Afghanistan. If these Taliban come swooping down a Kabul, you're going to have another humanitarian disaster. Then you got the Iranian thing. Then you got Putin taking over Syria. Putin's taking over Syria. He's going to run that country. All right? And Obama's worried about his legacy? Are you kidding me?
Did you hear what he just said? More refugees. This vacuum is creating this problem. More refugees. Not just a few thousand, but perhaps tens of millions. And they're all going to be, now the Russians are going to turn them back. That's not going to happen. That's simply, they're not going to stand there and say, they don't have a media that will say, oh, but it's the right thing to do. And, you know, the Metropolitan who runs the Russian Orthodox Church, he's not going to go out and say, oh, we have to do this. At my insistence, we should. It's not going to happen there. They're just simply going to say no. So those refugees, and they're not going to China. China's off in the other direction. They're not going to be allowed into India because of their primarily Muslim faith. So they're going to be diverted, and they're going to go across the Middle East through Turkey, and guess what? Into southern Europe, even more of them. And then there's going to be calls from the United Nations and our European allies, if you can call them that any longer, and they're going to say, you know what? The United States really needs to take these people because, well, after all, they have all that open space out there from Arizona all the way up to Montana and Idaho. That's the result. That's the situation. About a minute before we have a break coming up, you've got a few seconds. You're on the air.
Yeah, good morning. How you doing today?
What's up?
Well, here's my thing. The people got to remember that the world right now is as crazy as it's ever been in the history of the world as far as being unorganized, and it all comes back to Obama. Russia's doing what they're doing because Obama's going to let them. The generals can't go against Obama. That's not what they do. They have to. They at least they have guts enough to do their jobs and salute when they have to. but I would love to be sitting back in the corner listening to these guys. We're getting kicked around, and people keep supporting this guy. And if they vote in Hillary or some of the Republicans, they're going to get exactly the same damn thing.
Yeah, Casper Milquetoast. Thank you much for the call. We've got a break coming up in just a moment. Keith Thompson is going to be joining us from the Idaho State Police for a few minutes. And then before we wrap up the hour, Bethany Rasmussen. She's a 24-year-old candidate for Twin Falls City Council. She'll spend a few minutes and tell us why she's planning on, what she would do if she happened to be elected. That's on the way. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. It's 59 at 8:30. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, which means you can hear us anywhere all over the world online.